You need this more than I do.
Thank you.
We have to keep going just a little longer.
I'm tired.
Have you ever heard of a cowboy who sacrificed his own food to save a stranger's child? Sounds like something out of a fairy tale, doesn't it? But what if I told you this story actually happened in the heart of the Wild West, where the rules were clear, survival was for the strong, and compassion often seemed an impossible luxury? Well, that's exactly what you'll discover today. Stay with me until the end, and prepare to discover the journey of Jack Malone, a cowboy who made a choice no one expected, and that would undoubtedly change the fates of two lives forever. Imagine the scene, the blazing sun beating down on the arid Arizona desert, where the cracked earth seemed to be crying out for help, but there was no one to hear. Jack Malone, a lone cowboy, walked toward his next destination, but something felt heavy in the air. He wasn't alone, but it wasn't for company. He was carrying the weight of hunger, scarcity, and a daily struggle for survival. The last scraps of food were already running out, and he knew it wouldn't be long before exhaustion overtook him. However, in that vast desert, what Jack didn't expect to find was a small, vulnerable figure, practically fainting under the relentless heat. A child. Maria, an orphan girl, was alone, lost, with no one to protect her. But what truly surprised Jack wasn't her presence, but the look of desperation in her eyes. A look that somehow also reflected the loneliness and suffering he himself felt. There, faced with this unexpected encounter, Jack found himself faced with a cruel dilemma: save himself or save someone he would likely never see again. He knew his hunger was becoming unbearable. With each step he took, weakness overtook him faster. However, something inside him wouldn't let him move forward without doing anything. And it was then that Jack made a choice that would change everything. He gave what little he had, the last of his own food, to that unknown child. Without hesitation, without considering the consequences for himself. He knew his decision wasn't easy, but deep down he felt it was the right thing to do. That small, seemingly simple act of compassion would be the starting point for a story of courage, sacrifice, and perhaps even a little luck. Now you might be wondering what would happen next. How would a cowboy with nothing but his hat and a piece of beef jerky survive after making such a sacrifice? What would he gain by saving a child lost in the desert with no guarantee that she would be able to repay him? The answer, my friend, is something that will surprise you. Don't miss the next part of this fascinating story. What follows will transform the way you view true heroes of the Old West. Stay with me, because the best is yet to come. Now imagine the impact of this simple gesture by Jack Malone. He not only saved that child's life, but, in a way, he saved himself. Sometimes true courage lies not in facing the biggest battles, but in doing the right thing, even when the world around us seems to be falling apart. And this makes us reflect. How many times in our own lives have we had to choose between sacrifice and selfishness? Have you ever experienced something like this? Perhaps you've performed an act of kindness that seemed small but had a much greater impact than you imagined, or perhaps you had the chance to receive help when you least expected it. Stay with me, because this story will show you that everything can change with a single decision, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. I know you have something to share, and it would be amazing to hear in the comments how you see courage and compassion in difficult times. Perhaps you've experienced a difficult choice, just like Jack. Share your story or even what you've felt so far, because your opinion is valuable, and your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Leave a comment and be part of the conversation. Oh, and if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps spread stories like this, which need to be heard. I'm so happy to see this channel growing, and your support is essential so we can continue bringing you more content that moves and inspires. Every like makes all the difference. If you enjoy stories like this and want to see more moving moments, subscribe to the channel. We have many more powerful stories to tell, and I'd love to have you here with us for each new chapter. Together, let's build this community of people who believe in the power of compassion, courage, and of course stories that make us reflect on the best of humanity. Now, rest assured, because what comes next will surprise you even more. Jack and Maria's fate is about to take an unexpected turn. What you need to understand is that the Wild West wasn't just a land of cowboys and thrilling adventures. It was also an unforgiving place where the fight for survival was constant and the desert made no concessions. The landscape Jack Malone faced daily was vast and cruel. Imagine the immensity of Arizona in the late 19th century, an endless desert where the horizon seemed to disappear into a sea of unbearable heat and cracked earth. Every day was a fight for survival, and the life of a cowboy in the West was defined by a series of difficult decisions. The scarcity of water, the endless days on horseback, and the constant threat of bandits on the roads made everything even more challenging. The caravans that ventured into that territory often didn't return, and those who survived, like Jack, did so with great sacrifice. He wasn't a man of great ambition, just an ordinary cowboy, working cattle and trying to make the most of that dry, arid land. His daily life was lonely. The absence of other humans in the vast desert didn't make him feel any freer. On the contrary, loneliness seemed to be a constant companion, and the routine of hard work with no guarantee of success was a constant pressure on Jack's shoulders. What made his journey even more difficult, however, was hunger. As was often the case in this kind of life, food was scarce. Jack had only what the desert could find, and as strong as his horse was, nature and the lack of resources were relentless. He knew he would have to go even further in search of something to sustain him, but exhaustion was already taking over. The scorching heat of the sun seemed to grow, stronger as the days passed, and Jack had already begun to feel the consequences of his journey without sufficient food or water. Now, imagine what goes through the mind of a man like Jack when he finds himself faced with a dilemma of this magnitude. It's not just a matter of physical hunger, but of mental and emotional survival. He knew that a wrong choice could be fatal. But like cowboys in the Old West, he had something that motivated him: unwavering courage. Even in the most desperate situations, it was this courage that kept him standing, trying to move forward. The decision to help someone, a stranger, without knowing what it might mean for him, was something that could change the course of his life. And that's what happened when Jack found Maria, the orphaned girl, lost and in critical condition near a secluded road. The sight of her, disoriented and alone, touched something deep within Jack. Already at the edge of his own limits, he felt the urge to act. This encounter was no coincidence. Somehow the universe brought that child to him precisely at the moment when he most needed to decide whether to follow his own survival instinct or make the most difficult decision of his life. And, as if driven by an invisible force, Jack decided, right there in that arid and unforgiving desert, to do something many wouldn't even imagine possible. He gave up what little he had. The last meal that could have been his salvation was offered to that girl, a stranger. But what Jack didn't know, and what we've only just discovered, is that that simple yet immense gesture of sacrifice and humanity would make all the difference in his journey. Now think about it. What would you do in a situation like this? Would you choose to save someone in a desperate situation, even knowing it would mean putting your own life at risk? Jack did, and his story will show you that sometimes it's in the most difficult and unthinkable decisions that the greatest transformations happen. And here, I want you to stop for a moment and think about this. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between your survival or someone else's? Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this kind of sacrifice and the impact it can have on someone's life. Jack Malone knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Each step toward the nearest town felt like another endurance test, not just for his body, but for his mind. Hunger, like a constant shadow, stalked him. Closely, all that remained in his backpack was a small portion of dried meat, a scrap barely enough to sustain someone for more than a day. He knew it wouldn't be enough, but still, he thought, if I eat, I survive. If I don't eat, I weaken. The dilemma wasn't just physical, it was mental. He silently wondered how far he could go before exhaustion took over. Like many cowboys in the Old West, Jack knew every decision was a matter of life or death. The loneliness that accompanied his journey was an additional burden. In the vast desert, where the only sound he heard was that of his own horse galloping over the dry earth, he couldn't help but feel abandoned. It was as if the whole world had turned its back on him, and the silence of the desert, only made his loneliness seem even more profound. What hurt most, however, was the thought that he was alone in his struggle, with no one to share his fears, his doubts, his weaknesses. Each day seemed to drag on. The relentless heat of the sun gave no respite. The water, which Jack had always so carefully stored, was almost gone. He wondered how much longer he could continue like this. The long distances between small settlements and lonely caravans made searching for help nearly impossible. There were no safe roads. There was no plan B. All that remained was the instinct of a cowboy who, like all others, had been shaped to survive the harshest conditions the West could offer. Now, imagine what that does to a man. Hunger is a cruel feeling, but doubt is even more torturous. When you're on the verge of losing everything, when every morsel of food becomes a life or death dilemma, the decision to eat or not to eat isn't so simple. You're not just choosing between a piece of jerky or emptiness. You're choosing between immediate survival and the possibility of an uncertain future. Jack knew this. The despair of not knowing what would come next became a part of his daily reality. But at the same time, he felt the pressure of having to decide what to do with the little he had. Every small choice could mean the difference between a new day or the end of his journey. This internal conflict is something we all face at some point. We don't need to be in the Wild West to know what it's like to feel completely alone and without options. All of us, at some point in our lives, experience moments where our decisions seem to have the power to change everything, for better or for worse. It's this kind of dilemma that makes Jack Malone, a simple cowboy, a symbol of all those who have faced moments of crisis, where the line between sacrifice and survival is blurred. Jack's mindset, forged by the desert, was clear. Survival was the goal. But what he didn't know was that his journey of personal sacrifice and internal struggles was about to take a completely unexpected turn. As the sun slowly set on the horizon, creating a golden curtain over the vast desert, Jack found himself, for the first time in a long time, questioning everything he believed about himself. He was no longer just trying to survive. Something inside him, a deeper instinct, was pushing him to do more than that. Perhaps, he thought, a man's true strength lies not in how he handles the struggle for survival, but in how he responds to others, especially when the choice is difficult, like the one he would have to make later when faced with the child. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because the true twist in this story is beginning to unfold. Jack didn't know it, but that piece of dried meat, which seemed to be all he had, would be the beginning of something much bigger. What seemed like a simple choice to save the life of a strange child would become a turning point, a transformation that would change not only his life but Maria's as well. The weight of the decision rested on his shoulders, but what would happen next was something he could never have predicted. And here, I want you to stop and reflect. Have you ever felt like a simple decision could change everything? As if each choice were a fork in the road, leading you to an unknown destination? Write in the comments, I'm on this journey too. Let's talk about it. As Jack rode slowly along the narrow trail, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the distant mountains. The dry earth beneath his feet seemed to radiate heat, and he felt every muscle in his body protesting with exhaustion. The desert had a cruel way of slowing time, so that each minute felt heavier than the last. But in the midst of that vast emptiness, Jack noticed something unusual, a silhouette in the distance, almost camouflaged among the rocks. He squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the figure was still too far away. As he approached, the image became clearer. It was a child, alone. With disheveled hair and a lost look in her eyes, she lay against a rock, trembling. Jack stopped, his horse halting at the seemingly inexplicable scene. The hot wind blew, passed like a blade, and the sound of the desert, normally deafening in its solitude, suddenly became heavy, charged with a silent tension. Maria, the girl, looked up. They were empty, but at the same time, there was a strength there, the strength of someone who had been ripped from childhood too soon. Her eyes, so wide and filled with pain, stared at Jack, as if he were the last hope in a sea of despair. She could barely keep her eyes open, as if every second were a battle to stay alive. She didn't speak, didn't ask for help with words, but her pupils, dilated by fear and hunger, were begging for something that Jack, at that moment, didn't even know how to respond to. That scene, that look, It was as if time stood still. The cowboy, who had already faced so much adversity in his life, now found himself facing something that, deep down, frightened him. It wasn't the desert that frightened him, nor the bandits who could appear at any moment, but that small figure before him. What she represented was deeper. She represented everything Jack feared: the lack of control, the fragility of life, and the responsibility of doing the right thing when the choice seemed impossible. He dismounted, his muscles heavy and weak, but without hesitation. Jack's instincts prevailed. It didn't matter what he had or didn't have. He glanced at his pack, and for a brief moment, the image of that dried meat, his last meal, flashed through his mind. The choice was before him. What would he do now? He knew that eating that meal would give his body more strength, more time to carry on. But as he looked at the girl, a wave of compassion enveloped him like a tight embrace. What truly mattered now was her survival, even if it meant his own weakness. With a heavy heart, Jack knelt beside Maria. He took the jerky from his backpack and, without saying a word, broke off the piece. It was all he had, but at that moment, it seemed like the smallest sacrifice. Maria, with a bewildered look, observed the scene. Her gaze softened for a moment, as if upon receiving this simple gesture of kindness, she began to understand that she was no longer alone in the world. Silence fell again, but now, instead of emptiness, it was filled with a kind of quiet understanding. Jack needed no more words. He knew that saving that girl might be the greatest challenge of his life, but it might also be the greatest act of courage he'd ever performed. After all, this desert was beginning to teach him something, much deeper than he could have imagined. That, as lonely as his life was, he still had something very valuable to offer. He wasn't empty, as he'd thought. He had something no one could take from him. His humanity, his ability to choose, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because Jack's decision in that moment wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a reflection of something stronger, something the desert couldn't erase. The true transformation that began there in that arid desert wasn't just about helping a child, but about discovering one's own worth, about understanding what it means to be truly strong when one is on the brink of the abyss. And what Jack didn't know is that the impact of this gesture would change not only Maria's life, but also his in ways he could never have imagined. Jack was there, kneeling on the hot earth, the dried meat in his hands, and faced with a choice that transcended mere hunger. His stomach, empty and growling with weakness, screamed for food. He knew that piece of meat could be what would keep him alive until the next village, what would give him the strength to continue his journey. But when he looked at Maria, he saw more than a starving child. He saw a lost soul, a human being who, like him, was at the mercy of the vastness of the desert, and something inside him, something that could not be explained by the logic of survival alone, made him make the most difficult decision of his life. Jack's stomach was empty, and he felt his strength draining from his body with every second. He wasn't immune to the pain of hunger, but what his heart was telling him at that moment was clear. She needs it more than I do. On impulse, with an almost instinctive gesture, Jack cut off the piece of dried meat and handed it to Maria. He didn't hesitate. Even knowing that this gesture could be the one that dooms him, he chose not to consider the consequences. He chose to save that girl's life, not out of heroism or obligation, but because deep down he knew that this small sacrifice was the right thing to do. As the girl accepted the food, Jack watched her expression soften, as if the simple act of someone caring was enough to ignite a spark of hope in her eyes. Maria, who had previously seemed almost lifeless, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. She said nothing, but the gleam in her eyes said it all. She had found someone she could trust, someone willing to go beyond her own hunger, her own fear. This moment, this silent exchange, was more powerful than any words Jack could have said, but the contrast between the two was impossible to ignore. As the girl fed, Jack felt his own body wither, his energy draining from him like fine sand in the wind. He could hardly imagine how he would continue his journey without the sustenance he now provided Maria. The desert offered no compassion, and he knew he could count on no one else to help him. What remained to Jack was the will to do the right thing, to not allow himself to be lost in his own struggle. He felt a momentary peace as he watched Maria feed, even if this gesture meant he himself would face even greater hardships ahead. Now Jack no longer cared about his own pain. What mattered was the girl, her survival. He had made the choice, and in that moment he understood that some decisions aren't based on calculation, not on what you gain or lose, but on what truly matters. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about his own hunger, his own limitations. It was about something bigger, something that transcended the simple desire to survive. It was about humanity, compassion, and the true nature of a cowboy. But how could Jack, a man so close to exhaustion, continue his journey? How could he, with so little, protect Maria and guide her to safety? He knew the desert was full of dangers, and that if he didn't make the right decisions at every step, they could both lose the battle to the cruel immensity of those lands. Jack's hunger was becoming an unbearable pain, and he felt himself growing weaker. But the relief he saw on Maria's face was enough to get him back on his feet and keep going. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because in that moment something changed, not just for Jack, but for us as well. What happens when we make courageous decisions, when we put the needs of others before our own? What does this reveal about our own journey? For Jack, that sacrifice wasn't a simple act of generosity. It marked an internal transformation that would lead him to discover what it truly means to be a hero, not because of your strength, but because of the courage to do what's right, even when all seems lost. And as Jack headed toward the unknown, alongside Maria, he didn't know that this act of compassion would forever change the course of his life. What he didn't know was that the impact of that choice would be far greater than he could ever have imagined. Something inside him was changing, something the desert could never take away. And now Maria was part of that transformation too. They were about to experience something that, for Jack, would be much more than a simple journey of survival. It was a journey of redemption. Jack's decision to give Maria his last meal not only altered the course of his journey, but also brought something new into his life, something he hadn't had in a long time: the trust of another person. Jack felt it clearly when the girl, after eating, looked at him with a softness he hadn't imagined he could see in someone so young, someone so far removed from his own childhood. Maria's gaze, once lost and full of fear, now held a gleam of gratitude. Something was changing there, something Jack couldn't explain, but which he felt in every fiber of his being. The child, in her fragility, had given him a rare gift. She trusted him. Even without words, she trusted. It was a simple gesture, but profound. Maria, still staring at Jack, finally spoke. Her voice was fragile, but firm enough for Jack to hear clearly. "My family. My caravan was attacked." Her words were barely audible, as if each syllable carried the weight of indescribable pain. She explained with difficulty that her caravan heading west had been ambushed by bandits. She saw her parents taken but managed to escape, running aimlessly until the desert, unforgiving as ever, nearly consumed her too. What Jack felt upon hearing those words was a mixture of compassion and genuine fear for her. What could he do now? They were here, lost in the middle of an endless desert, without food, without water, without safe shelter. They were on a fine line between survival and despair, with no resources other than their own courage. Jack, already at his physical breaking point, felt a weakness overcome him, but something inside him pushed him to keep going. There was no turning back. The responsibility of protecting Maria now weighed heavily on his shoulders. What had been a situation of pure scarcity now became an even greater challenge. They had nothing. No food, no protection, no sign of help for miles. Jack knew the desert offered no mercy. And what could he do now, with so little? He felt the weight of his decision growing with each passing second. The thought that he might fail, that he wouldn't have the strength to save the girl, tormented him. But at the same time, something stronger kept him going. Maria's trust in him made him, in a way, stronger. Her presence, despite all the pain she carried, gave him a reason not to give up. But reality couldn't be ignored. What would they do without food? How could they move forward when all Jack could offer was his knowledge of the desert, and Maria, a vulnerable young woman, seemed as lost as he was? He knew that from that moment on, every step would have to be taken with immense care, because any mistake could mean the end of their journey. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because the true test of Jack's character began at that moment. It was no longer about the survival of one man, but about the survival of two lost souls, connected by an act of courage and compassion. What Jack didn't know, however, was that this simple act of saving Maria would set him on a journey more transformative than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about keeping the girl alive, but about rediscovering himself in the process, of understanding what it truly means to be strong. He was about to discover something far greater than the desert could teach him, and most importantly, what lay ahead of him was a journey of transformation, one that wouldn't just depend on finding food or shelter, but on something much deeper, the inner strength that arises in moments of crisis, when we are forced to trust someone or to trust ourselves. With the decision made, Jack knew that his and Maria's only chance of survival was to find a nearby town. Hope, which had previously seemed distant, now became the only thread holding them together. They had to keep going, even with the vastness of the desert stretching out before them like an unforgiving testing ground. Jack, with his strength diminished, knew the path would be arduous, but there was no other option. He looked at Maria, still so small and fragile, and felt something deep take hold of him. She was trusting him, and somehow that trust gave him a strength he thought he had lost. The nights began to grow increasingly cold. The desert, which during the day seemed to embrace everything with its scorching heat, transformed at night into an invisible enemy, chilling the bones. Jack knew he couldn't allow Maria to suffer this, but he himself was fighting fatigue and pain. There were nights when he could barely keep his eyes open, feeling his muscles scream with exhaustion. Yet, each dawn, he rose, reined in his horse, and moved forward. Not for himself, but for Maria. Every step he took was a step toward an uncertain yet hopeful future. But the desert wasn't just difficult because of the lack of water or the crushing loneliness. It was also a dangerous place, where death could come in many forms. Jack knew that wolves, hunting under the cover of night, could approach at any moment. His mind was constantly alert, his ears tuned to any sound that might indicate a threat. Some nights, he heard their distant howls, and he knew those animals were lurking. If they made the wrong move, if they became too weak or distracted, they could be caught. But there was something even more dangerous lurking in the desert: bounty hunters. Jack knew his own life wasn't safe, and that anyone seeking money might see him as an easy target, a lone cowboy accompanied by a young orphan girl. Maria, for her part, was beginning to see Jack in a way he hadn't expected. When she met him, she was broken, hopeless, and almost without the will to live. But as the days passed, she began to see him differently. Jack was no longer just a cowboy lost in the desert, but a protective figure, a kind of beacon of safety. He not only gave her the food he had, but also offered her something deeper, the presence of someone who, without asking for anything in return, was willing to sacrifice himself for her. Little by little, Maria began to see him as a father, and this change did not go unnoticed by Jack. She began to confide not only her words, but also her feelings. She told him more about her life, about her lost family, and about the fear she still carried within. Over time, Maria began to open up more, and Jack realized his own mindset was changing as well. He no longer thought of the desert as an enemy to be defeated. He now saw it as a journey he had to overcome for Maria, for her belief in him. The responsibility he felt was immense, but at the same time, he began to understand that true strength came not only from his ability to survive, but from the strength Maria gave him. Each day, with her trust, they pressed on, the wind biting and the challenges of the path becoming increasingly difficult. But with each difficult moment, Jack felt something shifting within him. He didn't know if he would reach the city in time, if safety would be real or just an illusion of the desert. But in that moment, he understood something much deeper about what it meant to be strong. Being strong wasn't just about surviving. Being strong was about enduring, even when everything around you seemed to be crumbling, and finding strength in others, in those you loved or those you learned to protect. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because as they walked through the desert, Jack and Maria were not only facing the harshness of the world around them, but also changing internally. Each day was shaping them, transforming them, and no matter how difficult their circumstances seemed, there was one thing no one could take away from them: the bond they had created, and the way their journey was beginning to reveal what it truly means to find hope where you least expect it. After arduous days and freezing nights, with the wind biting their skin and hunger gripping their stomachs, Jack and Maria finally spotted the city on the horizon. It was small, but it seemed like an oasis in the midst of that cruel immensity. Jack felt a wave of relief, but also of uncertainty. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, he knew something important was about to happen. They had faced the desert and the hardships together, and now Maria was stronger, more confident, like a flower blooming after a storm. When they arrived in town, something surprising happened. The few people who were there, upon seeing Maria, showed immediate recognition. Their gazes began to settle on her with a mixture of surprise and reverence. Jack felt the weight of the situation become even more palpable. The town, which seemed peaceful at first glance, was bustling for a reason he couldn't understand. Then a woman approached, eyes filled with anxiety, and addressed Maria directly. She didn't ask her name, didn't press for details. She simply looked at the girl and, with a tremor in her voice, exclaimed, "You're Samuel Weston's daughter, aren't you?" Maria looked at Jack with wide eyes. She seemed stunned, unsure of what to say. Jack, for his part, was at a loss. How could a simple child lost in the desert be the daughter of someone so important? The woman, already with tears in her eyes, repeated the question, this time with more urgency. "Maria, where is your father? He disappeared months ago. What happened to him?" Jack was in shock. What he knew was that Maria had been left alone, an orphan in the midst of an attack. But what was happening now made it all seem much more complex. Maria, still stunned, finally spoke. I don't know. My caravan was attacked and I ran for my life. I didn't know where else to go." The words came out as a whisper, but the woman seemed to understand the pain behind them. She looked at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and concern, as if she had finally found an answer to years of searching. Samuel Weston, one of the largest farmers in this region, was attacked by bandits on the road. They took him and everyone thought he was lost. But here is your daughter, the last thing needed to solve the whole mystery. What Jack didn't know was that by saving that little girl, he had taken a step towards something much greater than he could ever have imagined. Maria's life, which had seemed so ordinary until that moment, was intertwined with the story of one of the region's largest ranchers. Jack's simple act of compassion, offering his last meal to save a life, now placed him at the center of a conflict he couldn't have foreseen. But what was most remarkable was the transformation it was causing in him. Jack, who until that moment had been just a lonely cowboy, now found himself in a whole new role. He was no longer a wanderer aimlessly wandering the desert. He was Maria's guardian, someone who in a split second had completely changed his life. What had seemed like a simple act of kindness was now changing the course of his journey. The impact was not only external but also internal. Jack, who had always believed his life was defined by loneliness and the struggle for survival, was beginning to realize that his true strength came not from his ability to brave the desert, but from his ability to protect others, to act with compassion, even when it meant putting his own life at risk. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because Jack's story isn't just about what he did for Maria, but about what he learned in the process. He went from a lost man with no direction to a protector, someone with a purpose greater than he ever imagined. And the big lesson here is that often the choices we make, those that seem small or insignificant, have an impact that goes beyond what we can see at first glance. What Jack didn't know was that he wasn't just saving a child. He was saving himself, finding new meaning in his own existence. The story of Jack and Maria, when we look more closely, reveals something much greater than just a physical journey through the desert. In the Old West, hunger, loneliness, and suffering were constant companions. Every day, cowboys faced the relentless challenges of nature: water shortages, scorching heat, freezing nights, and the constant threat of outlaws. Life was hard, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But amidst it all, one thing rarely appeared: compassion. In the Old West, where survival required coldness and endurance, the simple act of helping someone, of sacrificing something for the good of another, was a rarity. And it is precisely this rarity that made Jack's story so special. Jack Malone wasn't your typical hero. He wasn't a man of wealth, power, or a man whose accomplishments are recorded in history books. He was simply a lonely cowboy struggling to survive, facing his own hardships. But in a moment of desperation, When all he had was a piece of beef jerky and the desert before him, he did something few would do. He sacrificed his own food to save a stranger. And in that simple act of courage, he changed not only Maria's fate but his own as well. Jack, who had lived in isolation, now found purpose and meaning in something greater than himself. The message of this story, my friend, is profound. In the Old West, where the harshness of life shaped people, a simple act of compassion could change everything. And it's not just about Jack's bravery or Maria's vulnerability. What really matters here is what this act represents: the decision to put the good of others above oneself, even when the odds are against you. Courage, humanity, and sacrifice are values that cannot be underestimated, for these are the moments that transform destinies and remind us that, in the end, we are all more than the circumstances we face. We are defined by our choices, by our acts of kindness, by the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. By doing this for Maria, Jack not only changed his own life, but he demonstrated something fundamental: that sometimes true strength comes from compassion and the ability to care for others, especially when there is so much to lose. In such a cruel world, he showed that there is still a chance to find humanity and purpose in times of crisis. Each of us at some point in our lives may find ourselves faced with a similar choice, a choice between selfishness and generosity, between individual survival and the willingness to do something for someone in need. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this point, because what we're seeing here isn't just a story about a cowboy and an orphaned child. It's about how our choices, our actions, our attitudes can change the course of our own lives and the lives of others. Jack, by making the decision to help Maria, transformed himself from a man lost in the desert into someone who found a new purpose. And this, more than anything else, is what makes us reflect. Humanity, compassion, and courage aren't just values for heroes in old stories. They are the values that define us every day on our own journeys. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story touched your heart, just as it did mine. And if you connected with this message of courage and compassion, I'm sure you'll find more stories that will make you reflect on the impact of our choices. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now. I'm always sharing stories that can transform the way we see the world and the people around us. And since you stayed until the end, tell me, and you, would you have the courage to share your last meal with a stranger? Comment below, because I love to know what you think. Oh, and if you like this story, leave a like here too. Your support helps bring more content like this, and more than that, it's a way to show that we're all in this journey of reflecting and learning from what life has to teach us. And don't leave just yet, because there's another story right here that will move you. Click here and come with me to continue this journey of transformation.